Then now it's time to define what kind of official regimes can be present in our life, because the problem is that in many cases central banks are saying something that what is their official exchange rate regime, and that on the other hand, if we are checking the data, then practically completely opposite can happen. So that's why today first we will check official regimes. So what are the definitions and so on. Then we will go through the consequences of these regimes, and after that we will check practical examples that what happened when countries were employing one or two of them. Okay, so last time we were talking about that most of the cases interest rates and inflation can guide currencies. This will be the present or the case today as well. So doesn't matter which exchange rate regime we will apply, this will be the guiding rules for the central bank. So still they have to be careful how to set their interest rates and also how to what is happening with the inflation. Obviously, if you don't care about the exchange rate, then you can focus much more on domestic issues. So yeah, this is what last time we stopped, and in this case we just have to focus on what is happening with the foreign trade, with all the gray areas or components, with the import and export, what is the impact of the foreign exchange rate on or external competitiveness on foreign markets, and also obviously if the exchange rate changes, then all the external funding, especially which is denominated in foreign currency, will be changing as well. So that's why if you are checking just textbooks examples are really good until we are on the set of advanced economies. But if we are focusing on emerging economies or even poorer economies, the problem will be that the importance of capital import will be higher and higher, and most of them will be denominated in foreign currencies. So even if the book says that, oh, if there is a depreciation in the currency, then it can promote growth, because if there is a depreciation, then our export will be much more competitive. Just the problem will be that at the same time, our debt levels will be higher and higher, because we are using foreign currency denominated loan, and in this case, this is how countries can go into circles of indebtedness. So depreciation can be a useful tool for stimulus, but mostly not for everybody. So that's why in the end of the semester we will have a specific course or specific class when I will talk about how these things are happening or affecting emerging economies. Yeah. So also last week we defined the following issues. So what affects currencies? Obviously supply and demand. So if you would like to avoid any market-related impact on currency pricing, then you have to shut down some of the demand or some of the supply for the currency, or at least you have to manage it, micromanage this. Also, funding. So outflow of capital, inflow of capital. If we would like to avoid any outflow, then obviously we have to restrict capital flows, and in this case we will also restrict the market determination of the exchange rate. And of course we can fine-tune all these things by setting interest rates, by also doing prudent monetary policy and achieving price stability, but also foreign trade will be definitely affected at the end of the day. So today's main document will be, and also main database will be, the IMF's annual report on exchange arrangements and exchange restrictions. And luckily this contains all the data from 1999 until 2022. I don't know what happens during the last 2 years, but they did not publish newer reports, which is really sad because until today, or until these dates, they were providing or categorizing all the IMF member states by their exchange rate regimes and also by their monetary policy regimes. So this one is a really, really good database, and this is what sets the rules for my research practically. So I'm really sad if, or I will be really sad if they are not following. But what kind of regimes does the IMF define? Because everybody tries to follow or fit into these categories. So first of all, we can have fixed or we can have floating like regimes. And in the case of fixed regime, we are always fitting the currency to another currency or to a basket of currencies. But in case of hard peg, so hard fixing, it's even more desperate. So the first case, we doesn't even have an own currency. So no separate legal tender means that we don't have any currency at home. We are only using key currencies, usually US dollars or euros. So dollarization is quite usual term. Euroization is not much, and sometimes it can be absolutely spontaneous. So if we have a hyperinflation in an economy, then it can happen that household starts to use only a key currency for their day-to-day operations, or if in the past there were high inflation periods and also depreciation, it can happen as well that a household starts to build up their savings in key currencies like US dollar and euro, and also as a result, companies are also starting to take up loans in key currencies. So, for example, in Serbia, half of the loans and also half of the deposits in the banking system are denominated in euros. So, just in the neighbor. And problem would be, okay, we can do it. So, we don't need domestic currency because in this case, we can get away from unsustainable monetary policy or unsustainable fiscal practices. Just the problem is that after this, we have to import the currency. So usually what happens here that inflation is still a bit higher than the US or than in the Eurozone because you have to earn this currency somehow. So you should have at least a surplus in case of the balance of payments, and at least in the level of balance of trade. So this is absolutely restrictive because of the necessity of capital import. So practically we need an export surplus here to get the necessary, let's say, US dollar. And also what we can see here that now the central bank is absolutely useless because everything is denominated in US dollars. So only central bank has some kind of degree of freedom because they have their US dollar reserve. And after that, from this money, they can still balance out the liquidity demand and surplus of the commercial bank system. But obviously, they are absolutely limited by their foreign exchange reserve. So this is a key problem here because the autonomy of the monetary policy is absolutely limited. So they cannot stimulate the economy. They cannot do any kind of restriction. What they can do at most is to support the liquidity demand in the banking system, and that's all. Also, as I mentioned already, that the US dollar scarcity will still guide the yield curve. So obviously, interest rates will be higher than in the US, even if we are using US dollar, because we must import it, we must grab it somehow and collect it. And also still these actors who must take up a loan in US dollar abroad, also their probability of defaults, so their partner risk will be higher than the US. So that's why sovereign premium will be still present. Okay, it will be way lower than if they would use their own domestic currency, obviously because there was a hyperinflation in the past, but still the problem will be that we don't have any degree of freedom. Currency board is less restrictive, so in this case, we can only issue currency by following a ratio of our foreign exchange reserves. So in this case, we have a set of, we are collecting some kind of a foreign exchange reserve, and after that, not the one-to-one ratio, so we can have higher ratios, but still the currency, the issued currency will be hardly linked to the foreign exchange reserve. So the situation will be the same, but at least the central bank has some minor degree of freedom. So at least they can set some domestic interest rates, which will be really close to the reserve currency interest rates. And after that, still they can do their job, just they are highly motivated still to maintain external balance. And also they have to build up this foreign exchange reserve because otherwise they are in trouble. And also, as you can see, yes, please, restrictive. So what is followed by countries mostly is some kind of a soft peg. So conventional peg and pegged exchange rate regimes with horizontal band, these are preferred by most of the economies which are following these systems. And in this case, you have some degree of freedom, and also in this case, you have a sizable economy. So in this case, now you cannot, as a central bank, you can't have much influence on the monetary aggregates, on the amount of money, not just in circulation, but also the size of the deposits and also securities in circulation. But so you have much more capable to use the interest rates for all of this. And for me, there is not much difference between the two settings. So conventional peg and pegged exchange rate with horizontal bands, usually they are absolutely the same. So we are setting the exchange rate that, okay, we would like to exchange this currency to another one. And after that, 1% or sometimes 2.25% is the fluctuation band. And it means that the central bank still must follow the interest rate of the targeted currency. So when I had to process the Danish central bank's monetary policy from 2006 until the middle of the 2010s, they had really simple monetary council decisions, because if whenever the European Central Bank was increasing the key policy rate, then they were following it, just adding 0.7% premium to it. Because Denmark wanted to introduce the euro, but after that, during the 90s, there was a referendum, and the referendum rejected the idea to introduce it, but still they wanted to do it. So at the end of the day, they introduced this pegged regime, and they had a wider fluctuation band, so they are following 2.25 if I'm correct, and but still they are absolutely copy and pasting what is happening at the European Central Bank. That was their problem during the 2008 crisis, because suddenly they realized that ECB was cutting down the interest rate, so they were cutting it as well to achieve some kind of stimulus. But after that, the ECB was achieving or went nearly to zero. So after that, they started to purchase. Well, at the beginning, they started to provide long-term loans, so longer-term loans, so 3 months loans, 1 year loans were provided by the ECB with similar low interest rates. And in this case, the central bank started to, or Danish central bank started to follow this behavior. Just at this point, they were not sure what to do. Because until this point, they were just following the international Fisher rule or the interest parity rule. But after that point, they were saying that, okay, now they start to use other asks. So practically, ECB started to use their balance sheet as instruments, and there are no clear equations for that one. So, and the problem is, okay, the second problem, that if you have low inflation within this pegged system, then it's okay. You will have also stable economy here, so aggregate demand and supply should be balanced if you have low inflation, which is good. But if external investors are realizing that, okay, this currency is stable, and they are starting to become afraid of euro or any major advanced economies bonds, then they start to diversify and they start to go to safe assets. So the problem will be that there will be an excessive capital inflow, which can also would appreciate the currency upwards. So Danish central bank had to introduce even negative interest rates on deposits. So I think that the deepest level was minus 0.75% to discourage the inflow of external capital. But the problem will be that, okay, but if you are setting like this, then it will be valid also for your own currency or for your own commercial banks. So this is how you can build up nice real estate bubbles. Because economic actors will see that, oh, interest rates are so low that we can build new projects. And the real estate bubble is the main problem because real estates have really long life cycles. So if you are building up a lot of houses, a lot of offices and so on, then it takes decades until amortization or depreciation will happen. So the problem is that, and also the market is finite. So you have a finite set of people who can take up a loan. Also at the same time, so even if in case of offices or warehouses, still we can say that, okay, the economy is growing. Sooner or later, they will absorb this excessive supply, but in case of population, there can be troubles. So the problem is that the central bank had to balance both in case of excessive capital inflow and danger of appreciation, and also at the same time how to avoid these bubbles, and in many cases this is the cause of the abandonment of the peg system. So Czech Republic had similar issues in the 90s and late 90s, in 1998, and after that they abandoned it and introduced floating regime. Other problem can be that if you have serious deficits, serious external deficit, like it happened in case of England during the 1992 campaign. What happened there that oh, this one is absolutely dead. Okay, so what happened there that they already had trade deficit because there was a minor, or not so minor recession during the early 90s, so not just here in the Eastern Central Europe, but also in Western Europe and even in the US as well. So their trade deficit was growing, but also at the same time their budget deficit was also growing. So they had a twin deficit at the same time, and also unemployment started to rise. But they wanted to maintain their commitment towards the fixed exchange rate regime, which was also in the 2.25% band. So it was quite flexible, but still relatively narrow. So they were starting to increase the interest rates, obviously, in this case, the recession was prolonged and it became deeper and deeper. So unemployment numbers started to increase. GDP decrease was also more visible. And what happened? That central bank also tried to stabilize the currency, not just with the interest rate, but they had the wise idea to stabilize it also from the foreign exchange reserve. And within a day, they were running out of foreign exchange reserve, and after that, they had to abandon the whole fixed exchange rate regime. So even they went into double-digit interest levels, and after that, they said that no, they cannot maintain it. Sweden had a similar experience also during mid-90s. They were even increasing the overnight interest rates to around 100%. So they tried to discourage anyone to speculate against the Swedish krona, but after that they had to abandon it and say that, okay, we are moving to floating. So mostly the sad reality with fixed regimes is that countries are always declaring that, oh, we will introduce this and now the state will be responsible for the foreign exchange exposure and this will be managed by the state. And after several years later, they have to abandon it. So we can find only rare cases when nothing had to do or no management or anything had to be done with a fixed regime. So the Danish case that still they are using it, it's absolutely a rare phenomenon or example. Because still the problem will be that your yield curve will be absolutely glued to the other yield curve, while we have to face with country-specific issues. Yeah. So, what is much more common and used for, these are absolutely temporary measurements, they are the rolling pegs. Or crow-like arrangements or stabilized arrangements also, they are absolutely the same. Just in the case of a crawling peg, we can see that we have a set level for depreciation or some cases for appreciation. So we can see that, okay, we have external default or external deficit. So trade deficit is present, also capital should be imported, and also because of external weaknesses, the budget deficit is also present. So we have also a twin deficit situation, and we know that we should depreciate the currency. But in many cases, countries have no idea what should be the optimal exchange rate. So in Hungary, in the 90s, early 90s, when during the transition, we lost 1/3 of our GDP. Also, we were using IMF funds since 1982. so for a decade now at that time, governments were depreciating the forints completely randomly with completely different levels. So it was absolutely non-transparent what will be the exchange rate. And also it created higher inflation. So inflation was also around 30%. And within this environment, governments were not able to issue long-term government bonds. So the yield curve ended after 1 year because or most of the long-term debt was funded through IMF or it was at least not so transparent. So the final consolidation happened in 1995 when governments or the present government realized at that time that they were reaching the limits. So they had high tax increases, they cut down welfare expenditures. Also they reduced, so the annual investment by the government at that year was zero. So no investment happened. So it was absolutely restrictive and austerity. And also at the same time, a crawling peg was introduced. And that was absolutely credible because everybody had the idea that, okay, currency should depreciate to one direction. But in this case, it was able to anchor expectations. And expectation anchoring is the most crucial thing, because after that, if you are able to anchor expectations, then market participants, investors will do what you want most. So in this case, currency started to follow this guideline. Inflation was decreasing nicely from 30% to 10% within several years. Even during the East Asian crisis in 1997 and 1998, the Russian crisis, this currency was still nicely depreciating, so it was not, there was no contagious impact from these crisis situations. And also the yield curve started to elongate itself, so the state started to be able to finance itself through long run. So crawling peg is a really good tool for consolidation. Obviously, you can use it for several years, maybe half a decade, and after that you have to abandon it and introduce something else. Usually, they are just increasing the range of the fluctuation band, and after that they are introducing some kind of floating regime. Crow-like arrangements are similar, just in this case it's not declared, but we can see that the currency is going somewhere, depreciating or appreciating trend is present, and it fluctuates within a narrow band of 2%, upwards or downwards. Stabilized arrangement, well, the IMF had no idea what is happening there, but still they can see that the volatility of the currency is really narrow, and it has some direction. So stabilized arrangement is like that. We should categorize it somehow, so we are putting in this. But again, the problem will be that it will create a lot of restrictions for us. So capital flows must be restricted, interest rates will be restricted, and also the external balance will be monitored. That we are always focusing on the balance of payments in this case, and also we are focusing also on the inflation. These two benchmarks will be followed, and once they start to stagnate, so once they start to become horizontal, then you are abandoning the rolling peg regime. Okay, because at the end of the day, this is the set truth that floating arrangements are behaving much better. So once we have a deep currency market, and also once we have deep enough domestic savings. So once we can say that, okay, now we have enough domestic savings to support at least the public debt and also domestic lending, then countries are moving towards floating regimes. In this case, it's not determined by the state that what will be the desired exchange rate. It's not managed by changes in the foreign exchange reserve. So what we can see that foreign exchange reserve change or volatility will be low or non-existent. So they are just keeping the foreign exchange reserve and not doing anything with that. And also interest rates, they are not changing so much. Obviously, the foreign exchange rate will change a lot. So it still can depreciate, it still can appreciate. I will show you many different examples. But at least in this case, the central bank can focus on the domestic issues, inflation and maybe growth. Even in floating regimes, sometimes we can find broad fluctuation bands. So 15% of fluctuation band is much more like a floating regime than a fixed regime, because it has a huge degree of freedom for the currency. But in case of free floating, then the central bank doesn't care. The central bank will only care about sudden liquidity shocks. Then in this case they can intervene, but otherwise they don't care. or they realize that they have no power here to care anything about this one. So, yeah, so in this case, we are just going back to the original set of functions. So let's see pros and cons, because also during the mid-90s, Oswald and Rogoff had this sentence that pegged exchange rate has a short life expectancy for any type of an economy. So as I mentioned already, in many cases, especially during the 90s, emerging economies were introducing these fixed regimes, and after that they had to abandon it because they were subject of some speculative attack, or it was absolutely not sustainable because of external imbalances. And that's why, if I have to choose between crawling systems or pegged or hard pegs, I always would select crawling-like system because they are much more transparent and we know what is happening there. Peg systems can be useful to reduce inflation, but the problem is that we have to face always with the Mundell-Fleming trilemma. So we cannot solve this. We have to choose only two of these cases. So if we need free capital mobility, and also we would like to have exchange rate stability within a fixed regime, then we don't have any kind of monetary autonomy. So we have to follow the guidelines of the International Fisher Rule. If we would like to have some kind of a monetary autonomy and also exchange rate stability, then we cannot have free mobility. So this is the Chinese dilemma in this case, that in this case you have capital restriction for inflows, for outflows, and you have to be really strict in hand managing. Also domestic liquidity, so you will have way higher mandatory reserves in the banking system. Even you have, or commercial banks can be forced to purchase government bonds to settle out inflow of external currency. So it's a different regime. Or you can say that, okay, I need free capital movement and also I need monetary autonomy. Then in this case, you have to say that, okay, now we don't have exchange rate stability. So in case of the Eurozone, when they realize that, okay, free capital mobility is necessary, and also since these countries are doing usually something between 60 or to 80% of their foreign trade are conducted with each other within the European Union. So in this case, they have to say that, okay, let's eliminate this foreign exchange exposure. So free capital movement will be combined with the single currency, but in this case, none of the central banks of the member states can do anything anymore. They will be just a subsidiary of the ECB. And externally, obviously, the euro is free floating. In this case, European countries or Western European countries checked all the possible combinations around the Mundell-Fleming trilemma, because during the Bretton Woods system after the Second World War until the 70s, they fixed their currencies against the US dollar, and in this case, they had some monetary autonomy. Just in this case, they had no or really poor capital mobility, so it was also not a great deal. Then, when the US abandoned, also temporarily suspended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, then all these currencies were trying to find their new ways. So they tried to fix currencies together by also at the same time maintaining capital mobility, and also they tried to maintain monetary autonomy. So it was disastrous at the end of the day. If we need a much more sophisticated graph to describe this situation, then we have the following issue, that capital flows are absolutely dynamic. So we can buy or sell things, bonds, shares, and so on, in real time. So in any second. So capital flows are absolutely dynamic. Economic policy at the same time is static, especially fiscal policy. So, okay, central banks can be fast reacting, but fiscal policy, oh boy, they are slow. Okay, they are operated by politicians, so their mental capacity is also limited, but even if they are not limited by their mental capacity, still we can say that fiscal policy is so interlinked into economic activity, tax revenues, the entire taxation system, and also they need a lot of data to understand what is their status within the business cycle. So a liberalized financial account will provide a fast feedback, just the problem will be that in many cases this will be absolutely nonlinear. So fractures or imbalances can build up for years until the next crisis will happen, and then you get a really fast feedback of runaway capital or sudden depreciations or flowing of capital and sudden appreciation, which happens in, say, even currencies. And also what we can see here, that capital flows will affect or will smooth out business cycles. So we really like them if we need capital. And also it smooths out output, consumption, current account, investment. So it can be a good thing, just also at the same time interest rates and currencies will be affected. Absolutely. And also people are saying that, yeah, but if we have floating exchange rates, then they can absorb some of the shocks. So still we can say that, okay, there is a depreciation, but this depreciation is way less harder because at least we have lower increase in inflation, lower increase in unemployment, lower decrease in GDP. But not for open and small economies in many cases. So we can see that everything is happening at the same time, unfortunately. So this graph is nice, but again, evidence development. Yeah. So how foreign exchange exposure can affect countries? So first of all, corporate profitability, corporate profit margins can be affected by changing revenues, expenditures for exporting and importing companies, but also at the same time leverage. So debt, liabilities will be also affected because of foreign exchange denomination. And also there is imported inflation. People are saying that nowadays, or at least during the 2010s and 20s, the impact of foreign exchange rate changes is lower on inflation than it was before during the 80s or the 90s. But this is mostly because of outsourcing of production to cheaper economies. And this had a huge disinflationary effect, which was provided by free trade. So if these countries start to implement different tariffs and trade barriers against each other, then we will lose this one and imported inflation will be back on the menu. Okay, so I mentioned already many pros and cons, but in case of hard peg, for dollarization, we can say that we already lost the currency due to some hyperinflation. So we can import maybe stable prices. Just the problem is that we don't have monetary policy anymore. We just have a bank which can manage other banks or can manage their liquidity crisis, and that's all the monetary policy. Currency board arrangement. Okay, we have some currency, and foreign exchange reserve and monetary aggregates are linked together until we can do it for a small economy. In the US, they try to manage monetary aggregates to stabilize the high inflation of the late 70s and in the early 80s, but they were able to do it only for 3 years. So monetary aggregates and amount of money are unmanageable in modern economies. For the small ones, yes, and for example, Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, I don't know which one, so some of the small Baltics, I think Estonia was, they maintained currency board until from their independence from the Soviet Union, so from 1992, until the introduction of the euro in the mid-2010s. So they were just following it, and after that they jumped into the Eurozone, so practically they Euroized themselves by joining the to the Eurozone, because from currency bond they went upwards in this list. In case of soft peg, so conventional peg and with the horizontal band pegging, we can say that this is for real size economies. So it's really good because it's against uncertainty, so we can see that what should be the exchange rates. It can stabilize export, it can stabilize import. If we don't have import restrictions, because it can sometimes happen. Oh, it's so nice that it's written that it disciplines fiscal and monetary policies. At least monetary policy will be disciplined, and fiscal policy will try to swim with the waves. Credibility. So it enhances attractiveness to foreign investors and lowering borrowing costs. But again, the problem is that if you are issuing bonds to foreign investors in key currencies, like it happened in Mexico in early 90s, the problem can be that if market sentiment somehow changes, so maybe it's not even your fault, foreign investors are afraid of something, or they have suffered losses at home and now they have to sell all their assets to stabilize their balance sheet. So the problem is that in this case they will start to sell sell the bonds in your economy, and it can create a depreciation in your currency because of the sudden outflow of funds. And what happened in case of Mexico, that they had to bond on the peg in 1994, and then they had to apply some floating regime. So lowering borrowing costs can be limited. If you are doing this funding in your own domestic currency, then okay, you can do it. Or if you do not rely so much on external funding, then also you can do something like this. Also, what is missing from here, that if you are careful enough, that you can set the exchange rate at a level where you have balance of payment surplus and trade surplus, then practically you can be competitive, but not because of technology, but because of the exchange rate, which can be good because if you are also modernizing the economy, so you are improving productivity on medium run, in the long run, then this can be useful. Just the problem will be that sooner or later you have to mitigate the inflow of this capital. So your central bank must purchase more and more external currencies or foreign currencies to avoid appreciation of your currency. So it means that you will build up a huge foreign exchange reserve, like it happened in Japan during the 70s and 80s, and also in China during the 2000s and 2010s. So, and after that you will sit on a huge portfolio of foreign denominated bonds, but you cannot sell it, you cannot convert it to anything, because in this case it would ruin the exchange rate. And yeah, you will have funds, just you cannot use it domestically that much. And also con, that it's really hard to maintain the credibility in this. So also central bank cannot focus on domestic issue, they must serve the maintenance of the foreign exchange regime. So if you have any economic recession, maybe you are not able to cut interest rates. So all financial consolidation will be the job of the government, so the fiscal policy, not the central bank. which can be tricky sometimes. So, yep, well, economic mismatch I mentioned already. So let's go to the different rolling-like systems. Again, the benefit is simple. This is good for economic consolidation. When you don't know what should be the exchange rate, then you are just appreciating it or depreciating it until you can see that now inflation and external balance is stabilized. But also at the same time, capital import will be constrained, and also the interest rate is still the function of foreign exchange stability, so it will not serve the domestic economy. And the next thing is that you don't have exit strategy. So you don't know when to exit from this system. Okay, you can have these domestic benchmarks, but if you are fighting against excessive appreciation, then you don't know where to stop. So the Swiss National Bank is fighting against excessive appreciation since 2011. And still what we can see that against Europe is still happily appreciating. So they tripled their foreign exchange reserves between 2011 and 2015. Even they implemented an upper ceiling to avoid excessive appreciation. When they abandoned it, the market went forward. So it's safe, it's Swiss franc, we should buy it. So if a significant part of global demand is running on your bond markets, then you cannot do anything. So they are still struggling with that one. Yeah. I think I mentioned already the benefits of floating regime. But again, so we can focus on domestic issues, so inflation and output. This is what we will learn in case of Taylor rule. Also, we have capital mobility, and in this case, it provides flexibility and autonomy for the currency. And maybe it can also stimulate export and import if we have trade deficit and surplus, but okay. We will see. Okay, so this beautiful graph, I think, is completely invisible. It's visible. So I worked 3 days on this, and okay, with not much results, but at least we can see that how different countries and how different currencies were jumping back and forth between the different regimes. So here down we can see the floating-like regimes. We can see that Sweden and United Kingdom was following free floating because they were already kicked out from their pegged systems already in the early 90s. So that's the reason. Okay, they abandoned all the things. Also, in case of Poland, they were following some floating or some peg or crawling-like system during the 90s, and when the time series starts from the IMF database, they were already in the free floating state. So that's different. The funny part is Switzerland, because we can see that, oh, they were happily in the free floating regime until crisis happened, and due to the sovereign crisis of the Eurozone in 2011, then they jumped to this upper ceiling regime, which was categorized as stabilized regime, and in 2015, in January, they abandoned it, so they went back to free floating until the next crisis happened, and they had to go back to stabilized arrangement. In this case, they had no upper ceiling officially, just they behaved suspiciously to the IMF. A sufficient level that they categorize them in a different way. So the different colors mean a different regions. So blue ones are Western Europe, or they are old EU member states. We can see also Denmark, which wanted to introduce euro, just it was rejected by the referendum. And also we can see the pink one is Switzerland, but The yellow ones are Central and Eastern European countries, which were they were really fast adopters of market economy during the 90s. So most of them had some kind of a crawling regime already in the 90s, and after that they abandoned it in the early 2000s and went to some kind of a floating-like regime, like in Czechia. Czechia is also jumping back and forth between the regimes, so they had similar behavior like Switzerland. Just they had to introduce upper ceiling in 2013 and to maintain it until 2017. That was the bachelor thesis topic of Mercedes Mészáros. So when she was submitting the thesis, then they abandoned the upper ceiling. So she was not so happy. And also what we can see in the case of Hungary, it was also funny because we had the crawling peg until 1999. Then horizontal peg was introduced, but in this case the fluctuation band was at 15% plus minus. So it was a huge fluctuation band, and they abandoned it in March of 2007 because in 2008 March, because the Hungarian forint was still appreciating, and they were saying that, oh, since there is an appreciation, then we should benefit from this one. Unfortunately, this appreciation happened only for 2 months, and then the crisis arrived, and there was a sudden depreciation. So it looks like that the crisis kicked Hungary out, or the currency out from the horizontal band, but practically it happened for several months without any outlook what will happen in the future. And after that, wow, Hungary is missing. Yeah, there is, okay, that's not missing. So until then, they were categorizing it into managed floating. And since then, it happily depreciates again, just as a floating regime. Also, we can see some countries which were using some kind of regime. So, in case of Slovakia, where is early Slovakia? We can see Slovakia in the case of conventional peg during the 2000s, and after that they jumped into the euro area. They were really good because they introduced the euro, or they were preparing themselves for the euro accession before the crisis. When the crisis happened, they were already part of the eurozone. So it was really lucky decision. And also what we can see here, that many Balkan Peninsula countries, which are represented by green color here. So Slovenia had the same strategy, that they were following a currency board system, and then in 2007 they introduced the euro, and then they were facing a poor growth period. So the problem is that until you have your own currency, you still have an impact on not the productivity, but at least external competitiveness of your companies. So even if productivity is not growing fast enough, then still you can play with this depreciation game, which I don't like, because companies should be price competitive because of productivity, not because of depreciation in foreign markets. So it's always a dead end. But in this case, what happened that, okay, once they introduced the euro, then their GDP growth stopped to exist for several years. So they had a stagnation period because suddenly this monetary stimulus disappeared from the background. It happens also sometimes that you need to even consolidate the banks because of this lack of stimulus. So partially this is what happened during the sovereign crisis in the Eurozone, that many Mediterranean countries like Portugal or Spain had to be not just bailed out by governments, but also they had to consolidate the banks to remove all the non-performing loans and to reset some of the economy. So you can introduce euro, just in this case, it can have an impact also on financial stability, that many things which were lurking in the background and were not visible because you were really good in statistics, or at least the central bank was good in statistics. Now it comes to surface in terms of poor economic growth. The Czech case is also funny just from the other perspective, because the Czech koruna is always appreciating. So it's the opposite of Hungarian forint. And I remember that when I was a student in the early 2000s, people were saying that the Czechs are not growing. So all the other countries in the region, they are growing fast enough and they will converge towards the Eurozone average in terms of living standards and all the other macro variables. And what happened? That, yeah, Czechs were not growing fast enough because they had a real estate bubble in 2001 or 2002, so they had to consolidate their banking system. But after that, Czech banking system was absolutely not restricted, but highly supervised by the central bank. So if they even integrated banking supervision into the central bank, so even today, one vice president is responsible for banking supervision. So they were not micromanaging, but highly supervising the banks. And IMF sent, so if we are checking the website of the Czech National Bank, they have always these press releases. And they got the message, annual message from the IMF, that please don't do this, please don't supervise your banking system so harshly, please remove bank supervision from the central bank. But what happened during the 2008 crisis, that they were just sitting there, everything is burning outside. Okay, other Swiss. So Czech koruna was depreciating a bit until it started to continue its appreciation, but there were not much crisis. Okay, unemployment data increased a bit because of German car makers in the economy, but that was all. So they did not have to bail out anyone. There was no foreign currency denominated debt for households. What happened even in Austria, not just in Hungary or Poland or Croatia, but even 10% of the debt of households was denominated in Swiss franc in Austria as well, which is nonsense. So they were just sitting there, and unfortunately, the appreciation started to become so harsh that they had to introduce this upper ceiling between 2013 and 2017. And after that, still we can see that they are jumping back and forth between floating and free floating, because sometimes the IMF is not able to understand what is happening there. And also, so I'm absolutely not a pessimistic, just okay, highly realistic person. So if it would be up to me, I would increase interest rates way harder. So I'm restricted from monetary stance. And when we were studying interest rate decisions in the region, so outside, even within the Eurozone and around the Eurozone, in different member states with my boss in Bratislava in Slovakia, we were able to see that only one central bank acted before the inflationary period. So Czech National Bank was acting half a year before they're supposed to increase interest rates. So they are really focused in this environment. So whenever they can see that, okay, there is a danger of inflation, then they start hitting everything with high interest rates, which is maybe not so good for the economic output. But what we can see that the volatility of the economic output is also way narrower than anyone in the region. So their convergence to Germany maybe is slower, but also steadier. So you don't have high volatility like other countries. Yeah. I also made this handcrafted figure to show that what happened. So what we can see here, that crawling pegs were applied practically everywhere in the region, or currency boards in the small ones, but otherwise crawling peg was a really useful tool. And once macro data stabilized itself, then they were introducing floating or introducing euro. Or in case of the Baltics, small Baltics, we can see that they were introducing euro after the global financial crisis. So they had to implement huge austerity decisions. And what was really strange that at the same time, so they were much more restrictive in terms of fiscal policies. And with way lower austerity measurements in Greece, governments were failing. In case of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they were even electing the austerity governments because they realized that they need euro. So it doesn't matter what is the price. So, yeah. And what we can see that COVID reintroduced some of the stabilized, or even pre-COVID period reintroduced some of the stabilized regimes. And nowadays we can see that this behavior of having floating regimes is not that common anymore. Governments are trying to hand manage things, which is maybe not that great. Okay, and then let's see some examples. So, the key example for depreciation is Hungary and Hungarian forint. So what we can see here that we had a crawling peg in the past, then we had this horizontal band until the crisis year of the great global financial crisis. And once it was abandoned, we had this floating regime, which is sometimes quite horizontal and after that depreciating even more. Last time I showed you that if we are checking the data, so how interest rate differential, real interest rate differentials are affecting this exchange rate, even the coefficient was negative. So we have this paradox of the uncovered interest parity. So on Thursday, I checked the whole region. So downloaded the data for Poland, Romania, and so on. Everybody, what we were able to see there. And the difference is that in many cases, countries are not even reacting, or currencies in the region not even reacting on the interest rate differential. So in case of Poland, there is nothing at all. So what is happening with the interest premium? It's 7% probability that it has any kind of effect. Nothing. Sometimes what I was able to see that the countries which are following still stabilized regimes, so they are not completely floating regime, in their case, their foreign exchange reserves were the key variable which defines that which variable is able to define the exchange rate. Sometimes even the international reserves of the ECB and the National Bank together. So it's also quite strange. So this is what we can see in the case of Czech krona. Yeah, they had their peg system until 1997, and after that they abandoned it and still then they are appreciating, sometimes with a limited appreciation, sometimes without limitations. If there is an external shock, still the currency depreciates, what you can see in 2008 and during COVID, but after that it jumps back and goes up because of the really restrictive monetary policy. In case of Poland, we can see everything. So once they abandoned the crawling peg system in the late 90s and they introduced this independent floating, we can see that this one is absolutely not following any kind of a trend. So this one is going sideways with sometimes enormous swings. So we can see that during the 2008 crisis, from appreciation, they were falling down to a sudden depreciation. And also at the same time, their GDP was not decreasing. So still they had a 0.6 GDP growth. So they were only the single country within the whole European Union which was not falling into recession. So it's because they are relatively big, so it's 36 million people. They are relatively close compared to these 10 million people economies in this region. But also they were affected by decreasing German demand. Yeah. And also, here's the Swiss. The Swiss case, I would also add the 70s, because they are suffering from the same thing second time. So we can see that, okay, there is this sudden or lot of, so practically they doubled. Well, they are not yet, but almost doubled the exchange rate since the mid-2000s. So from 0.6, now it's at 1.05. Oh my. When it was reaching 0.8 in 2011, I even created short positions. Oh, it will go down. It will never go to parity. Come on. My sheer luck was that within a month they introduced this upper ceiling. And when it jumped back, I was able to close down my position with some revenues, just I was really close to defaulting that position. So you have to be careful what to think of, because it seems that it's always appreciated. So, and also they had the same thing during the 70s when there was high inflation, relatively high inflation, so 10% of inflation in the US, and West German mark and Swiss franc was appreciating at that time a lot. So again, they are suffering from the same thing, second time. And last time, let's talk about Chinese exchange rate regime, because I'm absolutely confused what is happening there since the 2010s. Because if you are checking the data, so we can see that, yeah, when the Chinese economy was consolidated, and then it was started to focus on production of consumer goods and so on, also when they became the manufacturing center of the planet, then we can see that, okay, they were following a pegged horizontal regime. And obviously, after 15 years, their trade surplus became so high that they had to introduce some kind of an upward regime. So crawling peg was introduced and maintained until 2012, I think. 15, okay. Okay, sometimes they stopped around the great financial crisis, but after that they reintroduced it. But after that, the central bank announced, and if you are checking the website, still announces that they are introduced the managed floating exchange rate regime. But if you are checking data, so even today I was digging up the internet to find something on IMF website and elsewhere, and there is not much. So we can see that, okay, there was a depreciating period until 2018. Also, that was a time when there was this bubble at the real estate market in China. So a lot of shadow banks were financing huge real estate developing companies, which was really good in many cases, just some of them defaulted because of excessive capacities and lack of demand. So it created some depreciation, but this is so compared to Hungarian forint, this is not a depreciation. Come on, it's quite stable. Just it has a bit more volatility, and also this is still combined with the enormous foreign trade surplus. So later on we have to talk about China when I will talk about swap lines between central banks, because it will be also really interesting that nowadays what we can see that, okay, from foreign trade point of view, China is absolutely important. If we are checking also the usage of different currencies, also the third most relevant currency can be Chinese renminbi, but the problem is that since it's still not a floating exchange rate regime, so for me it's still a pegged, some kind of a pegged regime. Also there are capital flow restrictions. So if you have a company in Germany, you cannot take up a loan in Chinese renminbi because the bank cannot take up this loan. So you cannot do investments in Chinese renminbi, and also you cannot take up a loan, which means that it hinders the usage of the Chinese renminbi in foreign trade. So that's why they try to introduce swap agreements between different central banks also at this time period in the mid 2010s. But still the problem is that until these markets are not opened for external investors, then we will still see this struggle in terms of exchange rate regime. So right now, exchange rate stability is more important for political decision makers than to make this happen, because otherwise it would be maybe the third or second most important international currency. So it will be interesting to see. Just I'm waiting for it for several decades now.